Although the final act of a game is only a fraction of it, it can leave a bad enough impression on the player to impact their overall experience. That's why it can be detrimental even to games that made you fall in love with them in the beginning. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 incredible video games with weak final acts. Number 10, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Resident Evil 7 traps its main protagonist Ethan Winters inside a decrepit house where a family of horribly mutated psychopaths is constantly on the hunt for him. The setting of the game is a perfect horror story scenario, and the execution of Ethan's journey through the Baker family's residence is just as great. The story is filled with gory twists and heart-racing action sequences that can shock even a seasoned Resident Evil veteran. It has you on the edge of your seat at all times and rarely loses its pace. Resident Evil games at large have a tendency to have a weaker back half compared to what came before. RE2's Lab, RE4's Island, and so on are just linear runs. And this is also true of RE7. Once players are out of the Baker's house, they leave behind the nerve-wracking claustrophobic feeling of the game and instead find themselves mowing down Molded with a machine gun and facing off with the worst final boss in series history. It's not all bad, the last act has plenty of narrative weight to keep it going, but it's absolutely in the shadow of the incredible first two-thirds of the game. Number 9, Borderlands. The Borderlands series is known for two things: its over-the-top action and terrible final missions. Of the latter, the worst example in the entire franchise is definitely the original Borderlands. The majority of the first game is an absolute blast to play through, and it's arguably the best executed form of looter-shooter gameplay that Borderlands titles have to offer. Pandora is fun to explore, and the number of missions to do and weapons to use will make sure you never feel bored. So what goes so wrong in the end? Well, as you progress through Borderlands, the main story mission keeps hyping up the end goal of your journey, the enigmatic vault containing a terrifying secret beyond all imagination. You're led to believe that your final challenge will be a battle with a cosmic horror of epic proportions, but when you finally open the vault, the only thing you get is a handful of weak tentacles that go down in a matter of minutes. The ending is a complete disappointment and makes for a rather awkward end to your otherwise epic journey. It just goes to show that the most thrilling secrets might be those that never get revealed. Number 8, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor's main gameplay is great, but it's not really suitable for crafting a scripted story sequence, as evidenced by its utterly underwhelming final act. The bulk of Shadow of Mordor consists of slaying hordes of orcs that are generated with unique traits, skills, and abilities, forcing you to think of proper strategies to eliminate them, as well as seeking a way to use their deaths to influence their tribe's inner power struggle. The mechanics at hand, where enemies remember your actions and act accordingly, are amazing at creating a one-of-a-kind experience that utilises the game's open-world aspects to their fullest and adds to the overall replayability value. However, when it comes to facing a story-relevant character, the system falls flat on its face. In the final battle against Sauron, the developers simply gave up on the idea of making the enemies special. Your fight with Sauron's Hand is a series of generic QuickTime events, and Sauron himself doesn't even show up for the fight. He flees the scene right before you can get to him. None of the fighting you did matters in the end, and honestly it makes you wonder if a random orc from Sauron's army wouldn't make for a better primary antagonist. Actually, come to think of it, Sauron's Hand and Evelyn, which is the worst final boss? Let me know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like this video as you scroll down. Thanks. Number 7, Half-Life. Back in 1998, Half-Life was a marvel of innovation and ingenuity that immediately topped the gaming charts and was deemed as a masterpiece of the FPS genre. Its reputation as one of the best games ever made holds up to this day, but this said, some Half-Life chapters are more replayable than others. Most Half-Life fans would agree that the second half of the game is far less fun, if not downright terrible when compared to the rest of the game. The beginning chapters deliver on Half-Life's promise of being a more interactive and open form of FPS without fail. The chapters after On a Rail begin to slowly devolve into a series of convoluted mazes, annoying gimmicks like the conveyor belt system in residue processing, and everyone's favourite, a water level. Yay! The problem here isn't even that the later chapters are bad, they're simply unimaginative when compared to the rest of Half-Life, and they rarely help the title separate itself from its shooter contemporaries. After all, Valve wasn't trying to make another Quake with Half-Life, it was an FPS revolution, and unfortunately, its second half isn't up to the challenge. Number 6, Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 is the most iconic and popular title in the series, and it owes a huge part of that reputation to one of its primary antagonists, Vas Montenegro. Vas is also the reason why, even though the first half of the game is an absolutely incredible experience, most people don't really have much to say about the second half. Although Vas is the face of Far Cry 3 and nearly all of the game's most memorable moments can be traced to him, he actually serves as an antagonist for less than half of the game. You kill him before you even leave the first island, and after that the plot and your interest pretty much derails itself. Since Vas serves so many different roles, acting as the island's boogeyman, your nemesis, and also your motivation to keep fighting, once he's gone you can't help but feel like there's not much left to care about. The de facto main villain, Hoyt, doesn't leave nearly as big of an impression, and you honestly don't have the same kind of drive to defeat him as you did with Vas. The true definition of insanity is removing your lead villain halfway through the game. Number 5. Mass Effect 3. Although the free content pack and the extended cut DLC eventually fixed Mass Effect 3's ending, the disaster that was the original version of the final mission is such an important part of gaming history that it would be a mistake not to talk about it here. In terms of its gameplay and overall story, Mass Effect 3 is arguably the best in the series. However, when it comes to the conclusion of the game, the word train wreck comes to mind. Despite all the choices you made throughout the series and how they usually had a further impact on the story, the final mission cared very little for it. Instead of choices and consequences, it presented you with 3 near identical options that then concluded your entire epic adventure with a few minutes of slightly altered cutscenes. That's it. The ending felt like such a slight to your 3-part adventure with Shepard that it stirred a huge controversy involving angry petitions and even fundraisers asking BioWare to change it. And given that the fixed version we have these days is much more bearable, they seem to have worked like a charm. Number 4. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is the pinnacle of the open world genre. It provides you with a huge but detailed map to explore and the freedom and tools to do it however you would like. Exploration is rightfully a huge aspect of Breath of the Wild, and you'll spend the majority of your time in it discovering fascinating new parts of Hyrule. However, this more open-ended format of gameplay does come at the cost of the more linear story-based parts of the game. The last mission of Breath of the Wild makes this painfully obvious. The final battle at Hyrule Castle is unfortunately the weakest part of the title. After spending so much time doing whatever you want, the straightforward design of the castle is like a chore you have to trudge through, and the culmination of your efforts is somehow even worse. The face down against Calamity Ganon feels more like a gimmick than an actual fight. It lasts only a few minutes, and compared to the dangers and enemies you face while exploring, it barely qualifies as a challenge. Seriously, a random Lionel you accidentally stumble upon is more threatening than the supposed doom of all of Hyrule. Number 3. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is a cult classic of the RPG genre. The game does a brilliant job of immersing you in its dark world of bloodsuckers with a gripping storyline and a plethora of options to progress through it. This said, due to the financial struggles of Troika Games, the studio responsible for Bloodlines, the game is far from perfect. It's riddled with bugs and odd errors, but worst of all, it completely drops the ball in the final act of its story. Whereas the first few chapters of Bloodlines contain plenty of engaging side quests and give you an almost entirely free hand when it comes to dialogue and gameplay, the latter part turns into an incredibly straightforward and boring sequence of fights with angry goons. Your only real choice is where you want to fight these angry goons. There's barely any meaningful dialogue or alternative ways of resolving conflict in the latter parts. You either pick up a weapon and fight, or you don't. And while it can be fun to make use of your vampiric powers, being forced to do so in a non-stop gauntlet of repetitious combat is just tiring. Anyone who had to suffer through the sewer level in Hollywood knows exactly what I mean. Number 2. Boulders Gate 3. Boulders Gate 3 has received so many awards, including Game of the Year, that you'd think it's a flawless masterpiece. However, while it's definitely worthy of all the praise that it is getting, even the most die-hard fans of the game will tell you that it has one blatantly obvious problem, and that's the third act. It's a common agreement among the Boulders Gate 3 player base that the final act is the weakest. Although it's almost as long as the first two, it lacks the amount of content and variety you find in the beginning of the game. Most quests feel more linear than usual, there's a smaller variety of things to do, and most of the overarching quest lines, like your companion's personal missions, are resolved so hastily that you almost don't realise that they're over. Now, to be fair, as of 2024, Larian is still releasing patches that flesh out their game, but as it stands, Act 3 feels like a watered down version of the incredible experience you find throughout most of your playthrough. It's almost as weak as Orin, and that's saying something considering she also needed a patch to make her a more competent boss. And number 1, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV may be the most disappointing example of a great game taking a bizarre left turn with its quality in its second half, not just amongst Final Fantasy titles, but any video game. The start of FF15 introduces novel mechanics and concepts into the franchise that break away from the standard Final Fantasy formula, and make for a refreshing and fun experience for both old franchise fans and brand new players. On top of that, the main cast of characters is likeable. It doesn't take long for you to grow fond of their goofy group dynamic. In fact, it's the biggest highlight of the game. This helps most players become invested in the story. But then, likely due to its 10 years of rocky development, the quality of the game drops harder than the frame rate on the PC version. The latter parts of Final Fantasy XV are riddled with bugs, glitches, and bland and uninspired level design. The pacing of the game also takes a blow, becoming very erratic and at times confusing, as plot beats and characters appear out of nowhere and then vanish as quickly as they came. For this reason, even if you fall in love with the game in the beginning, by the end of Final Fantasy XV, it's hard to be as appreciative.